This is my first piece of propaganda, with Donald Trump pointing to the Republican flag, or the Russian flag. And so my talk is going to be about Russian propaganda and the Republican disinformation war. All right, my second piece of propaganda is about me. I'm not going to talk a lot about my career, but I am a pioneer in what we call open source journalism and foreign policy analysis. So back when social media was brand new, all of a sudden anyone had the ability to take out their cell phone and video whatever was happening. So if let's say a tank were to roll down the street here, God forbid, and we were to take video of that, we would upload it to social media and we'd say, hey, look at this big news story that just happened. The problem is, if I'm a journalist, let's say I'm a journalist in the UK, I don't know where Northborough, Massachusetts is, and I certainly don't know any of you folks. So now I'm seeing posts about this tank rolling down the street, and it's junk. It's unverified news. So somebody like me came along and worked to turn social media into actual data journalism, and that's a whole other talk. But I have written for a couple of different publications that have been my employers, including my last main magazine was called The Interpreter, and we were ultimately funded by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, so it's the United States government, and I've freelanced for Foreign Policy Magazine, Daily Beast, Reuters, and dozens of publications. So that is me in a nutshell, and that is me looking terrified on CNN, the worst interview of my life. Buy me a drink and I'll tell you all about it. All right, let's get into it though. These are great quotes. They're probably all real, and I'm going to skip it because we don't really have that much time. All right, this very happy sailor volunteered for the submarine service. What you're looking at is propaganda. Propaganda is the deliberate, systematic effort to reshape perceptions, manipulate cognition, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. In this case, the propagandist is the American military. They would really like you to volunteer to be a submariner. That job is awful, and so you're going to get this young lady, they promise. It is a couple of points to keep in mind. It is deliberate and strategic. It's not an accident. It is something that is designed. The analogy I'm going to use is I have a desired, if I'm a doctor, I have a desired effect. I'm going to create a pill. Propaganda might be that pill. It is designed to influence behavior or belief. It's not just to inform, but to actually change your minds or change your actions. It's often manipulative. I don't know if all these submariners had as much success as this young man, but let's hope. It can include selective information, that's the big one, emotional appeals, distortion, or outright lies. It can be true, this is important, propaganda can be true. In fact, I encourage all of you to engage in propaganda. Quote me on that. Because propaganda is often the dissemination of a very complex idea down to a very simple tagline. And when we talk about reaching a Republican in Idaho, we've got to do that on maybe a postcard. So we've got a lot of work to do. It is not always true. It's often false. Usually, almost always, in fact, it's somewhere in between. I'm sure that some submariners had great success with the ladies. But what makes it propaganda is the intent and method, not just whether it's factual. Some great examples. We got some old example, socialism. We've got some sort of demon throttling Lady Liberty, I think. We've got some really racist, propaganda from World War II you might be familiar with. And this I stole from a pro-democracy anti-Trump group of a Trump supporter licking a boot in a tinfoil hat. I want to go quickly over three things: misinformation, propaganda, and disinformation. Misinformation is just inaccurate. It's something that's inaccurate. It's often spread by us, usually unknowingly, okay? I'm going to give you a perfect example of misinformation in a little bit. But propaganda is intentionally spread, not always false, but intentionally spread. And disinformation is intentionally false. Disinformation is always, mostly, or entirely false. It's designed to deceive and manipulate, not just advertise. And the context is key. So your propaganda doesn't have to accomplish everything. If that picture of the submariner was the only way the United States got you to join up with the war effort, they probably would have lost the war, right? The context is in the broader scheme of things that we talk about, the ecosystem of influence. Nothing works alone. You're more susceptible to a piece of propaganda if it reinforces 80 million other things that you've encountered. And you're more susceptible to it if you've heard it from multiple angles. So if you have a friend who's a submariner and he's having luck with the ladies, that poster might hit you pretty hard. Propaganda and disinformation have a target audience. This is really important too. It's about you specifically. But another piece of propaganda may not be aimed at you specifically. It may be aimed at somebody else. So everything is designed, again, as an ecosystem to have its own effects. And almost always, it relies on emotion. Emotion is key. We are all victims of propaganda. All of us. I'm going to say that again. All of us. I grew up, my parents were incredible people, extremely informed, pretty liberal, and I was born in 1981, which is shockingly close to the end of the Vietnam War. And my parents talked about Vietnam War a lot. And they were very much anti-war. They were very much engaged in the anti-war protests. And at one point, in a conversation about the war, my dad said, and the reason they fought the war, everybody knew that we were going to lose the war, but the corporate interests, the military-industrial complex, the people selling the weapons were pushing the politicians, we got to keep the war, we got to keep the war, we got to keep the war. That's a message I grew up hearing, and I might make some enemies here. But in the years since, okay, tens of thousands of hours of audio have been released, not just from the White House, but from Congress and the military. Hundreds of thousands of documents have been released. Hundreds of thousands of documents from the companies involved have been released, and there is not one piece of evidence to suggest that an American company lobbied a politician to continue the war for money. Not one. That shocked the heck out of me. In fact, it's actually more terrifying in a way, because that meant that rather than an obvious answer that we were somehow being duped by a terrible system, actually really well-intentioned people really wanted to fight that war and lied to the American people about it for years. Terrifying. We're all victims of propaganda. We're all perpetrators of propaganda. If any of you have a dating website, if you do any online dating, I'd be happy to explain to you how that is propaganda. Anybody who has Facebook, that is propaganda. We all rely on others to tell us information. This is really important, okay? We had an amazing presentation a couple of, I guess last month by Rachel Suriani. And Rachel is brilliant. She's a doctor. Chan Medical School, and my guess is if I had to ask Rachel to describe to me in great detail what the COVID vaccine is and what's in it, she could not tell me. But Rachel probably could tell me better than anybody else, right? But we all rely on other people for information, and that is okay. But we rely on an ecosystem to teach us whether those people are reliable. And that's where the breakdown comes in. That's where the misinformation comes in. So we are skeptical of facts that debunk our preconceptions. If you have a belief about something, and it's a strong belief, and you hear something negative about that thing that you believe, that's really hard to shake. Some of you may be experiencing that right now as I was talking about Vietnam. That is very hard to shake. Bill Cosby, when I was growing up, was called America's dad. He had the greatest image of any human being I'm aware of, and he was my hero and everybody else's hero. Allegations about Bill Cosby were there from the very beginning. Now look, there are probably allegations about every single famous person who's ever walked, okay? So, but those allegations, even when they had details, even when they had evidence, even when they had witnesses, took 4.5 decades to erode Bill Cosby's image because we had a preconceived image of him that was so strong. We all have confirmation bias on the other side of that. We love information that verifies what we are sure we already know. And most human beings have I would say a gut understanding of truth, good and bad, okay? If somebody came in this door and just started throwing footballs at people, you would all duck. You wouldn't go through some calculation about, geez, I wonder if he has enough footballs to hit us all in the face with it. You would just duck. It's your gut instinct. You're going to go with it, good or bad. Tribalism fits into this. Your tribe is under attack. That thing you believe is under attack. That group of people you believe is under attack. Your initial reaction isn't going to be to think it through. And some of this is okay. In fact, some of this is necessary. But it is also where disinformation loves to play. All right. I'm going to real quickly talk about the history of how the Russians weaponized disinformation. It didn't happen overnight. It took them basically 100 years. And yet, the end of the talk is about how the GOP learned and mastered and cooperated with the Russians to do that very thing. So, not a history talk. Just a talk with some history. So we got the Soviet era with some beautiful Soviet propaganda here, World War II. All right, Soviet, USSR, 1945 to 1991 is what I want to talk about. Propaganda and disinformation is strategic, it's bureaucratic, and it's ideological. And there's always three audiences to Soviet propaganda. So one of them is domestic. We got Soviets talking to Soviets, the Communist Party talking to Soviets. And inside the USSR, it's very top-down messaging. So the Communist Party is going to tell the state media what to say, and the state media is going to say it. And by the way, the Soviet people do not necessarily believe this stuff. In fact, a very good friend of mine, colleague, Catherine Fitzpatrick, worked and lived in the Soviet Union for about 40 years. And she said that the difference between Soviet propaganda then and Russian propaganda now is everybody knew it was propaganda back then, and very few people seem to know it now. It's terrifying. But the party messaging wasn't there necessarily to convince you that they were right, more to convince you, or to inform you rather, of what opinion wouldn't get you shot. So this is the talking point on this issue, and you really need to have the talking point on that issue. That's what it was really there for domestically. But where it gets interesting is foreign. So the first world, us, the West, Europe. We were also a target of Soviet disinformation. And it's really designed to destabilize and divide. We're using propaganda to amplify existing structures. So racial injustice, they're going to try to push that button. The Vietnam War backlash, they're going to try to push that button. Anti-capitalist sentiment, they're going to try to push that button. It mostly targeted Western leftists and intellectuals because the Soviets saw them as ideologically closest to themselves, and so they had a better chance of manipulating those folks. And the real goal of it was to spread doubt about the morality and consistency of Western foreign policy. Doubt is really, really, really important, okay? And propaganda and disinformation you don't have to be convinced that it's right. You just have to begin to doubt. And I'll give you the example. Let's say there's a warlord in Africa and he just starts murdering people, and it's in Botswana, and I don't know anything about Botswana. Raise your hand if you know a lot about Botswana. Okay, we didn't get any hands raised. Cool. So there are media reports about this person. They're conducting massacres in Botswana, and then there might be a call to, hey, we got to do something about it. And then you're exposed to information that says, hey, wait, that guy's not the real bad guy. This other person is the real bad guy. That guy's trying to fight the bad guy, okay? And now I don't know anything about Botswana. I've already lost interest. I have enough doubt that I am no longer excited about this issue. This is an issue that I'm just going to say, you know what? Someday I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll have an opinion and we're going to move on. But if the reality on the ground in Botswana is black and white, and this doubt has created gray, the doubt has been a very successful weapon in changing our foreign policy. So you can see how it works. Let's see. I want to give a great example. During the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was really ramping up the Cold War. He ran on pushing the Soviet Union. He ran on ramping up the pressure on the Soviet Union. And yet, during the 1980s, we also had the AIDS epidemic. And it was a real crisis, and it was real scary. You probably know about it more than I do if you're older than I was, because I was a kid. But there exists a thing called Operation Infection. Operation Infection was what we call an active measure, a KGB active measure. It was an active disinformation campaign launched by the KGB to convince Americans and foreigners that the United States military had actually created AIDS in a laboratory and pushed it out to targeted audience. And it worked. You can find this stuff today. If you Google, AIDS in the US military, you will find people today who swear by that. So this stuff works. And they would disseminate this sometimes through pro-USSR publications. Some were blatantly pro-USSR, some were more covertly pro-USSR. But they would also plant documents, which is what they did with Operation Infection. They planted a news story in a newspaper in India, a small newspaper in India, and it cited a fake scientific report. And from there, it actually got major news coverage. Eventually, it snowballed and got major news coverage in the United States and across parts of Europe, citing this fake paper, or this real paper that had a fake story with a fake scientific report. All right. And then the third world. The goal of the Soviet Union was to recruit as many nations, I mean, it was our goal too, recruit as many nations as we could to fight the enemy. So, United States on one side, USSR on the other side, how many of these countries can we get to change sides? And we both worked pretty hard on that. All right, now we get to an interesting shift, because the Soviet Union ends. And from 1991 to 2008, all the people who did this propaganda for the Soviets, they didn't go away. In fact, many of them took up leadership positions within Russia, including, of course, Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB agent. And now he's, a politician and moving Russia towards those sorts of methods in the mainstream. And this era propaganda is fragmented. It doesn't really know where to aim or what it's really supposed to do. But in 2005, we have the launch of Russia Today. Hey, that is Liz Wall. She's an American, former American journalist who became a news anchor for Russia Today. In fact, you've got Abby Martin, Tom Hartman, Chris Hedges. These are all American journalists who joined the Russia Today television network. And RT, it later became RT, but Russia Today was beamed into millions of homes in the United States. You can find it online, and it was on some cable offerings as well. And the focus was mostly anti-Iraq war. So it launched in 2005. The Iraq war starts in 2003. And the goal of it, a lot of Americans, especially people who were already anti-war, are seeing a narrative there that they just weren't seeing in American journalism. And again, the narrative is not necessarily false, okay? By the way, 72% of Americans supported the Iraq war, including more than 50% of Democrats, okay? 72% of Americans supported the Iraq war. So the small group of Americans who did not support the Iraq war were a minority, and they were looking to something like Russia Today as really inspirational, and I remember that era well. Also, we're judging me on my knowledge, not on my PowerPoint presentation, because apparently I left a little thing there. But the goal was to do a couple things. You wanted to re-legitimize Russia. Russia is really reintroducing itself to the global audience. We're not the USSR anymore. We're new and reformed in Russia, and we have a moral leadership. They really wanted to push that narrative. The other narrative was the Western colonial narrative, the narrative that everything that bad happened was because of Western colonial policies. And again, elements of truth, elements of fiction, lots of gray, but you didn't get the gray on Russia Today. It became complicated issues, become very black and white, but very different from the narratives that you were going to find. And they're really testing this soft power idea, this idea of can Russia, which is not in a good state at this point, it's not really a military superpower anymore. They're pretending they are, but they're not. They're not an economic superpower anymore. They're pretending they are, but they're not. Can we use this? Can we use disinformation and manipulation to become a leader in the world again? And again, the left is still at this point the primary target with mixed results. But something happens in 2008. So, real quick, Vladimir Putin legitimately elected in 2000, and yet by 2008 he's run his course on being a legitimate democratically elected leader. And so I won't get into the history too much, but he begins to realize that in order to stay in power, he's going to have to pull a lot of rabbits out of his hat and really destroy his own democracy. And he begins to do it. And one of those moves was to invade Georgia in 2008. And this marks a huge shift in Russia, but also for all of us. We just didn't know it because we were really distracted by some other things that were going on in 2008. The Iraq War is ongoing. It's not going well. The Afghan War is ongoing. It's not going well. The biggest global economic collapse in generations has just happened. It's not going well, and the Americans have a presidential election. So, yeah, Putin's invading Georgia. Can you find Georgia on a map? We don't care. And this is where Russia really shifts in its domestic policy and its propaganda policy. All right. This is where I want to talk a little bit about what I call the propaganda funnel. How does propaganda get made? Okay? Because it's specifically designed to target specific groups of individuals, maybe disaffected Massachusetts liberals. And we got an audience, we got what we want them to do, and how do we make that? How do we turn that into a pill that we can give them, a little information pill, and we can convince them to swallow it, and then we can see the outcome spiral. So, at the very top, we've got the architects, okay? The strategic originators. And they're the ones asking, what do we need to get the American people to do or not do, or believe or not believe, in order to move policy? And this stuff there are whole teams at the FSB and the GRU, Russian military intelligence, who are working on this conversation day and night, and they've been working on this conversation day and night for decades, and we have absolutely nothing like this. We have been at war with Russia since at least 2008, and I'm still not sure most Americans have figured it out. We got ideological think tanks and PR firms. I could give a whole 4-hour presentation about how PR firms impact everything you know about everything. But they are also creating and weaponizing propaganda, not just advertisements, but they're doing things like PR firm might get hired to put together a conference and to get the guest list for that conference and to get the speakers for that conference. So if I'm invited as a journalist, I appear to have been invited by the organization that's putting it on, let's say GAIN. But in reality, I've been invited by a PR company. And once I get to that conference, everybody in the room was invited by that PR company, even though nobody knows the name of that PR company or what the total client list of that PR company is. Okay, because that's all a secret. And now we're all in a room, and I know journalists, and I know industry experts, and when I want to write a story about a developing story, I call one of those people, and it's all a setup. PR companies are doing this work. We've got actors like Steve Bannon, famous for being in the Trump administration. This is the kind of work Steve Bannon was doing before he joined the Trump administration. I would argue he's never stopped. All right, so what do? They develop core narratives and goals. What are the core narratives that I need to move you towards? They design disinformation campaigns specifically to credit or discredit, to shape your opinion on those core narratives. And they choose targets, tactics, and emotional triggers. So for instance, and I'm going to get into this example in depth in a minute, Kremlin is at war against Ukraine, and we're going to get you all to believe that all the Ukrainians are Nazis. and it's going to work a little bit. All right, so that's at the top. They create this. But then you've got the engineers. These are the tactical manipulators. These are the people who are actually figuring out, well, that's a great idea. We want all Americans to drink more milk. How do we get them to do it? Got milk? Funny piece of propaganda. Did you know that the United States per capita drinks the most milk of any country in the world? We also have the highest rate of osteoporosis. Got milk. Just going to throw in some propaganda. Everybody's awake. So the engineers are the message manipulators. They're going to refine and distort and mutate the narrative for emotional impact and viral spread. They're going to design the pill to get into the infected patient. Often these conversations are happening. Russian agents are participating in conversations on Reddit, on Discord, on Twitter, but that's actually pretty high level. We're talking 4chan. We're talking some websites that you've never heard of, these little chat groups. And you might have somebody who's in there who's a neo-Nazi. And you might have somebody in there who's called an incel. Look it up. And you might have somebody in there who's a Russian agent. And they don't necessarily know who they're talking to, but they're going to workshop these ideas together. They're going to have conversations. They're going to design the pill. And the people working on it may or may not know that that's actually what they're doing. This is really important. And then once you've started to design that pill, you got to get it out there. You got to test it, run some clinical trials. So you're going to do that with Russian agents. These are people, or PR agents. These are people who have a Facebook account or a Twitter account. My favorite PR agency that I worked with was a pro-Bahrain government Twitter account run by a grandmother who had thousands of people who followed her knitting club and her knitting videos. She had been working for years, living in Florida, making these knitting videos, and had a big knitting club, and she'd go around to local churches and knit, and she became the most important player for the Bahrain government to discredit. I'm not making this up. It is crazy, okay? That's who you need. She is going to be an engineer at some level, and she's also going to be a disseminator. We're going to get there too. But you need bots. You need trolls. You need to get the message to the right people to see whether it works. And then once it does, we're going to refine it. We're going to add emotional and cultural and conspiratorial hooks. We're going to make YouTubes and Telegram accounts and all kinds of stuff. And then we're going to get to maybe the most important people. These are the disseminators. Some of the disseminators are also the engineers, and some of them are the normalizers. But that's where you see they've gone from workshopping those ideas now to mostly spreading them, and to monitor how they're being spread and whether or not they're catching up, to amplify things or pull things back or tweak things. We got a lot of partisan bloggers and podcasters, conspiracy theorists, well-meaning but misled activists. And then at the big end of that funnel, we got the Russian state media, Sputnik, okay? Raise your hand if you've ever read an article or seen a video from the Russian news agency Sputnik. We got a handful of people, but not most people. Doesn't matter. Because what happens is those ideas are reaching millions of people, and then they're joining, now they're becoming mainstream. Even if Sputnik doesn't become a name. The people who are out there who want to amplify these messages, they know what Sputnik is, and they're going to get those messages from Sputnik, and they're going to share it from there. And we've got foreign and domestic actors working together, okay? Because the Russians are still working on disseminating. But now we've got their people from their target audience They don't know it's Russian disinformation. They've got this new wonder pill. They took it. They like the effects. They're going to spread it. And this is where the content begins to share virally. And it looks like a grassroots movement. It looks like, hey, all these people are talking about this thing on social media. But it's not a grassroots movement. It's a polluted stream, and now TikTok is spraying it all over you. I don't like that analogy. I'm going to axe it next time I give it. All right, and then we got the normalizers. If it reaches to this level, we've got a serious problem, okay? We've got mainstream media. If I'm going to cover a news story, I'm a TV anchor, I've got 3 minutes to do it. I'm going to have somebody on the left, I'm going to have somebody on the right. I'm going to have somebody on warring party A, I'm going to have somebody on warring party B. I'm going to have expert on this issue and an expert who opposes that issue. They're going to talk for 1.5 minutes each. This side says this side that says that. And you, the public, don't know that, yeah, but one of those sides is feeding you a weapon. It's not a medicine, it's not information, it's weaponized disinformation, and you're swallowing it because you saw it on CNN. I tell you, I could go on a long list, and I've got a few mentioned, of real propagandists who are working in some of these, not necessarily working for major media companies, but make regular appearances, including on NPR, on CNN. Oh yes, it's a long list. And they're going to academics, okay? We have a tendency on the left to really trust academics, because I personally really trust academics. I put a lot of faith in academics. Some of the worst propagandists I've ever met were academics. Because if you were a specialist on, say, something like Iran is a great one. You're a specialist on Iran. I can't go to Iran. If you gave me a plane ticket to go to Iran, I would not accept that plane ticket. I would be arrested on the tarmac. Now, I have a lot of friends who have gone to Iran, but they're special cases. Most people, if you're anti-Iranian government, if you've been writing and exposing the corruption there, you can't go there. So next time a professor who travels there all the time, has a lot of sources in Iran, raise an eyebrow. How'd that happen? And then this is now in the mainstream. And sometimes it's a controversial opinion, and sometimes it's a debated opinion, and sometimes a cable news host is going to say, well, there is an argument made by some, but it's disputed, but it's out there in the mainstream. And now it's public belief. False ideas become part of public consciousness. Media literacy breaks down. The narrative shapes votes, protests, or foreign policy. There are millions of people who believe that NATO provoked Ukraine into, NATO provoked Ukraine into sparking Russia to engage in that war, okay? People will tell you that NATO expansion is the reason why Russia is so aggressive. And Mikhail Gorbachev had to give an interview talking about how that was total BS. That is a mainstream narrative, and it's in the public. Saddam Hussein behind 9/11. No, he wasn't, but 72% of Americans thought he was. Vaccines aren't safe. We've all heard that one. Okay? Of course they're safe, but we've all heard it. All right. I want to give an example of the funnel. I want to give you an example of a single piece of propaganda and how it was made and why. And so I'm going to go to my favorite story, which is Ukraine. It's a place I've spent a lot at. That building in the background is Hotel Ukraine. I stayed there for like 2 weeks, only to find out that it's one of the worst hotels in Ukraine. For half the money, I could have been staying at this gorgeous hotel down the street. I had no idea. Okay, this picture was taken in Ukraine 2014. We're going to real long story short this one. Large anti-corruption protests in Ukraine, and the protesters were demanding that the government joins the European Union. European Union has a lot of laws against money laundering or fraud, and if you were a victim of corruption, you really like these laws. So you get a lot of people, not just young people, but pretty much all the young people, saying, hey, Ukraine, we got to join the EU, we got to fix our government, that's the way we're going to do it. And it got so bad that the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, he says, you know what, okay, I get it. Yeah, we're going to join the EU. And then at the very last minute, he pulls the rug out from the Ukrainian people and says, I'm not going to sign the European Association Agreement. And it doesn't go well for him. Massive protests in the street. Protesters slept in Maidan here in the square for 93 straight days in the middle of Ukraine's winter. Ukraine has cold winters. This was one of the coldest Ukrainian winters on record. And for 93 days they stayed there. And the protesters prevailed, and the government ultimately fled to Russia. And 3 days later, Vladimir Putin deploys soldiers all over Crimea and captures Crimea. And within about a month and a half, he's invading eastern Ukraine, and he's lying about it. So what happened? I want to show quick. I want you to put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes real quick. It is 2014. You have massive protests against your government in 2008, in 2010, and in 2012, all related to your attempts to basically defraud the electoral system. The protests in your own country appear to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But in 2011, you have pro-democracy protests that toppled the governments in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, well on their way to toppling Syria, one of your key allies. And now you've got protests in your own streets. Vladimir Putin, very, very upset. These pictures are of Ukraine. That's Ukraine on a map. That's Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, talking to probably 1 million people. And this is one of the statues in the middle of that square where there was basically an ongoing, very violent battle between protesters and police, and the protesters are winning. If you're Vladimir Putin, you're looking at this and you are sweating bullets. That is a zoomed out picture of this square. One of my favorite pictures, this is probably taken during a funeral. Over 100 people were killed in these, 100 protesters were killed in these clashes between the government and the people. And they held the protests, or they held the funeral right there in the middle of the protests, because all around this, the police are fighting battles to put this crowd down, and the crowd is just too big and the crowd is winning. If you are Vladimir Putin and you're looking at this, you're having a real bad day, okay? Within a couple of days of taking this picture, the pro-Russian government of Ukraine is gone. You've got a real problem, because now you've got a really incredibly inspirational pro-democracy movement literally on your doorstep. Same culture, same history. This is coming to Moscow, I promise. Well, he figures that out. So he annexes Crimea. So at this point, you need a military strategy, but most importantly of all, you need a propaganda, disinformation strategy. You need a communication strategy that is going to prevent what happened in Ukraine from happening in Moscow. And so we got the architects. the Kremlin, the strategists, the GRU, the FSB, Russian Ministry of Defense. And their job is to justify aggression. Russians are going to have to go into Ukraine militarily. We got to justify that to Ukraine. We got to justify it to the world. We got to justify it to our own people. That's the problem. We've got to delegitimize this Ukrainian government. That shouldn't be too hard. The president is now an interim president. Was it really a constitutional process? We got to attack it. We got to frame Russia. Basically, have to say, hey, Russia is the victim here. Russia is helping the Ukrainian people. Russia is not the one attacking the Ukrainian people. We got to get that out there so that when Russia gets blamed for starting a war in Ukraine, they can say, well, we're liberators. But we're also going to come up with this really clever strategy where we say, yeah, and it's not us, by the way. If it is us, then those soldiers are good and they're doing a good thing. But it's not us, so don't worry about it. In fact, this picture on the left, this man in the center here is Igor Strelkov, and he's a retired, I believe, a colonel in the Russian military. Something interesting, the Russian military has no official retirement. You don't retire from the Russian military. You literally cannot retire from the Russian military. It's also true of the FSB and the GRU. There is no such thing as retirement because they can call you at any point in time. So he's a retired guy. Now he's saying, hey, he shows up in Ukraine and he's saying, hey, I got some guys. They're Ukrainian, I promise. They've got some guns. They own their own guns. They're just good people, and we're here to take over to make sure that government, that Ukrainian government that's full of Nazis, that's so terrible, doesn't take over this town too. And so he does. And we're supposed to believe that that guy on the left is not a high-ranking member of the Russian military intelligence. He is. And we're supposed to imagine that that guy on the right is not an officer in the Russian paratroopers. He is. But you didn't hear from me. These are just Ukrainians, okay? Okay. We have to paint the pro-democracy movement as a color revolution, like the Arab Spring, the Jasmine Revolution, the Orange Revolution, all these revolutions that have names. We're going to paint them as revolutions that are just coups launched by the United States and NATO. And again, if you know your history, the United States launched a few coups in its day, right? We used to do this a lot, especially in the 80s. Before that, in the 50s, in Iran. Okay, lots of great examples. This isn't one of them. Okay, so any great piece of propaganda, any great piece of disinformation has got to be grounded in something, because if it doesn't resonate, it ain't going to work. So you gotta find something that's real, and you gotta hide Russian involvement. Again, these guys aren't Ukrainians, we promise, or these guys aren't Russians, we promise. The engineers. We've got to have Telegram, which is a Russian, basically a Facebook kind of a thing, but Russian controlled. We're going to have conversations on there. We're going to make memes. We're going to have an anonymous accounts posting stuff, social media accounts, conspiracy influencers. We're going to have bloggers. Okay, we're going to get this network of people to spread information that the media doesn't want you to know. I can't put enough air quotes over any of that. And the pill that they want you to swallow with Ukraine is that Ukraine is just a bunch of Nazis. That the new government in Ukraine are Nazis. Nobody likes Nazis, right? So Soviets defeated Nazis in World War II. So we defeated Nazism. We're going to do it again. We're going to come to the defense of our Ukrainian brethren. We're going to fight these Nazis. There's a famous Ukrainian during World War II, Stefan Bandera, basically a Nazi sympathizer. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I don't want to defend Stephen Bandera up here. He was kind of a bad guy. So we're gonna paint these new folks who are taking control in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. We're going to paint them as Nazis and Banderites. No problem. So we've figured out the pill that we want to send, right? And we're going to start leaking footage. Well, Ukraine has Nazis. Most places do. The footage up top is not, the picture up top is not real at all. The picture on the bottom, I believe, is. So we've got a swastika in both places. Russia has a far right, or Ukraine has a far right. And at this period of, and I don't want to defend I don't want to defend all of the ideological positions of like 80 million people who live in Ukraine, okay? But yes, there are Nazis among them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take their example and we're going to broadcast every mistake or terrible thing or a terrible image that has ever come out of Ukraine. And if we don't like the amount that we have or the quality, we're going to make our own. And so we got the Azov battalion and some Nazi flags, some Nazi tattoos. We're going to defend Donbass, which is the eastern Ukrainian region, from these Nazis. And then the disseminators. Once we've got all this stuff all over social media, now the state media is going to come in and we're going to codify it. Get some really high production video quality, get some reporters who are well known, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier. A lot of those Russia Today journalists are American journalists who are now working for the Russians. So we're going to get them to echo all this, put it all together, and put it into a nice package and really amplify it. By the way, a lot of them quit over this, including, I think, about half the people who I already mentioned. Liz Wall, she quit Russia Today because she realized that she was a tool for some of these messages that were blatantly false. And this is the reason why she quit Ukraine. And we're going to spread this to all over the world, okay? It's not just the United States and not just Russia and not just Europe. We want this message to catch on in Africa, in the Arab world, and in Western audiences. We're going to fire up the troll farm. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing it, but Russia has a massive troll farm. These are huge office buildings with thousands of employees, and their whole job is to amplify and spread Russian talking points, okay? And they're disguised as people like you and me. Some of their English skills are awful, and it should be obvious that they're Russian trolls. Some of their English skills are really good, and by the way, they're paid based on how good they are. But when you've got thousands of them, again, it doesn't matter because one person who speaks English really well, who puts out a coherent thought, is going to get retweeted or shared or liked or whatever by thousands of Russian bots. Okay? And some of it is also is mechanical, is automated as well. So they're using software to create fake tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of fake profiles and fake bots, and they're gonna, again, send messages, amplify messages. And it looks like grassroots. And look, I mentioned a couple names real quick. Scott Ritter, U.S. weapons inspector. When I met Scott Ritter, he was one of the only UN weapons inspectors who said that Saddam Hussein didn't have chemicals of weapons of mass destruction. Problem is that idea that was true, that he was knowledgeable about, made Scott Ritter just adopt any anti-American ideology that he ever heard. And he became a pure BS artist. And he's not the only one. Eva Bartlett, Jackson Hinkle, doesn't matter. A lot of really famous people hop on this bandwagon. And this is where you start to see a shift in Russia's audience. Because they're still working on the American left, particularly the far left, but now you're also targeting the American far right. And again, we're going to talk Nazis. You're going to target African American communities, immigrant communities, Jewish communities, to get people of all different stripes to start to think that the government in Ukraine is just a bunch of Nazis, because these folks don't like Nazis. If you get enough people in this demographic, and enough in this one, and enough in that one, and enough in that one, well, you're your mainstream opinion. And once that happens, you can shape American policy. Anti-interventionist is a big one, okay? Everybody remembers the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, so anytime there's a problem anywhere in the world, we're going to say, oh, this is just some American neocon who wants to invade another place for oil. Again, is there some truth to that? Is there some falsehood to that? Yeah, I mean, in Ukraine, it's totally false. And then it gets normalized. Glenn Greenwald was a journalist for The Guardian. He started The Intercept. He is one of the most prevalent promoters of Russian propaganda alive. Rolling Stone's Matt Taibbi and his friend Mark Ames. Matt Taibbi worked for Rolling Stone for decades. He wrote huge, very important articles for them. He and his friend Mark Ames, who's also a journalist, wrote a whole book about basically publicizing how great it is to rape Russian women. I'm serious, you can look it up. These guys were very insidious forces and hired by major publications. Tucker Carlson, we know. And, we know him now, but if you knew Tucker in his early career, he was always conservative, but he wasn't the kind of crazy person he is now. And he became that way. Of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And you've got a lot of both sides journalists. Again, journalists who are trying to give you an accurate position, an accurate understanding of what's going on, and they're saying, hey, this narrative exists and this narrative exists. That was never good enough for me. As a journalist, that was not good enough for me. I made my journalism by figuring out, yeah, this narrative exists and this narrative exists, but this is basically BS. And if you don't take that step, you're just doing this. You're just amplifying, you're normalizing it. Because when normal people express these points of view, even with skepticism, you are now normalizing this point of view. It is normal to have this point of view. Ukraine, by the way, quick reminder, Jewish president. I believe there are only 2 Jewish world leaders in the entire world, and one of them runs Israel. So, not a Nazi. Yeah, it's important to note, Barack Obama, we think of the American left right now as being extremely supportive of Ukraine. Barack Obama refused to give any lethal aid to Ukraine at all because he believed that that would invoke and incite more Russian aggression. And I don't know a single Russian expert or Ukrainian expert that supported that opinion. That opinion came right from Russian propaganda. Joe Biden heavily criticized for his lack of support of Ukraine. Joe Biden didn't want to give Ukraine some of its most effective weapons and really dragged his feet on that because he believed it would escalate the war. I don't know how you escalate the war from what happened in February 2022, the largest land invasion since the invasion of Iraq, but whatever, somehow that piece of that idea that if you just don't anger the Russians, they'll leave you alone, persists in multiple political polls, the left and the right. And then it's become public belief. There are polls that show that a sizable percentage of people believe that Ukraine has a Nazi problem and many people remain skeptical of Ukraine. And here we go. At least one of these pieces is completely propaganda that I made. But you've got Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck putting Vaseline in his eyes, Tucker Carlson, Matt Gaetz, and Donald Trump himself. The GOP weaponized this. They were watching, people like Steve Bannon were watching this stuff happen with great interest. And as time went on, they began to fuel and they began to participate and they began to cooperate with the Russians. Let's skip ahead a little bit. Donald Trump's birtherism is the perfect example. Donald Trump alleged that Barack Obama was not born in this country. That was a radical statement that he did not come up with. Donald Trump did not invent birtherism, folks. These Russian trolls, these far-right trolls, again, operating on websites like 4chan, which is a website, none of you go to 4chan, please don't go to 4chan. First of all, you couldn't, no, just don't go to 4chan. Just take my word for it when I say that 4chan is a very small website where the kinds of ugliest conversations are happening, and that stuff is being amplified through that funnel that I talked about earlier. Breitbart. The GOP didn't used to stand for this kind of stuff. You may agree with them or disagree with them, okay? But when I met John McCain at the height of the first Russian invasion in 2014, this was not the GOP I knew. The GOP, that's maybe a whole separate conversation about why they got this way, has become as potent a disseminator and creator of disinformation as the Russians ever had. It is Russia's greatest accomplishment, what we are seeing right now with Donald Trump. And you know what? It continues to this day. Steve Bannon's favorite words, which I won't quote, but maybe you can read them, okay? Using trolls, radicalizing their base, the QAnon conspiracy world, if you're not familiar with it. All of this stuff is built on and sometimes built by Russian disinformationists. And so you've got the GOP and the Russian government sharing the same infrastructure, using the same methods, learning from each other and cooperating with each other, whether they know it or not. Some of them do, some of them don't. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown that you can actually link some of these accounts that were millions of accounts that were supporting Russian disinformation, then supported Trump disinformation in 2015 and 2016. That shift was real. And we've now got a GOP that is the antithesis of the truth. The big lie that he didn't win the election. The big lie that we are being invaded by immigrants. Okay? The big lie that there's voter fraud. That we need this bill that we talked about earlier that would make it almost impossible for many women to vote. All of that stems from this funnel. All right. I've done way too much talking. As I'm talking, I want to put up this propaganda funnel because I do think it is a really good way to understand how this information is being manufactured for your digestion. Any questions for me? Yes.
This is a little lengthy, so just give me.
Yeah.
Because kind of one point might lead into another. This might just be a question of semantics, but somehow it's niggling in the back of my mind, so I need it clarified. I feel like, with the upper echelons of the GOP, Trump, RFK, et cetera, that it's almost like we're skipping down to they're the normalizers, you know,
Yeah.
like Trump. I know you called him an architect, but I feel like he's a normalizer. Like meeting with the South African president and showing videos of white crosses and saying those are the graves of white South Africans who were killed, when actually that was false. They were memorializing the death of 2 white South Africans on a farm, and actually far more blacks have been killed than whites, so there's no genocide going on.
Yep.
But him actually bringing that immediately into, you know, supposedly a diplomatic discussion, or RFK talking about the Spanish flu having been started with a vaccine. And so that leads me to a question. I remember reading in the New York Times that in '87, Trump was, according to 2 very high operatives in the KGB, made an operative in '87 by Putin. And this was after the Senate Investigative Committee,
Yep.
a report came out. So what do you know of that? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so this is what's going to scare you, because you nailed it. in your Donald Trump is the normalizer.
Yeah,
So who's the architect?
good question, yeah.
Who's the engineer? Who are the disseminators?
Who's the architect?
Okay. I have a friend, and he writes about QAnon, but for a long time, all he did with his day, he was a journalist, all he did with his day was trying to find out where the stuff Donald Trump said comes from. Donald Trump didn't create these Photoshops, okay? Donald Trump normalized stuff that had already come through the funnel. So Donald Trump has his own agenda. You know, I don't want to say that he's agentless. That's not true, right? Donald Trump has no moral qualms. In some ways, he's allied with this. What frustrated me with the Russian collusion investigation is we saw on national television the collusion, which is, there's no secret meeting between Donald Trump and the Kremlin. The Kremlin doesn't work that way. They're not stupid enough to pay they're not stupid enough to create an employment contract with Donald Trump that says, "Dear Donald Trump, you are now an agent of the Kremlin, and you will blah 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 blah, and in exchange we will blah 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 blah." When he stood on that podium and said, "Hey, the Russians, please hack Hillary Clinton's email," and then they did. That was it. That was the collusion, because he knows and they know that they're on the same team. That was it. He didn't need some meeting. They got right to it. In fact, what we know is they had already been doing it. So, but to your second point, you said it really well. I can't say it as well as you did. Can you just rephrase it again?
The second point was that I read in the New York Times.
Oh, his being a Russian agent.
Yeah.
So, I have mixed feelings about this. Donald Trump is a Russian asset. He is a Russian asset. He is someone who they can manipulate. He is a Qatari asset. A Qatari asset, an asset of the country of Qatar. They're the ones who gifted him this jumbo jet. He's extremely transactional person. So if you are doing, and he loves making deals, if you were doing Donald Trump a solid, he's going to do you a solid back. And Donald Trump's very existence is accomplishing everything that the KGB never could. You know, Vladimir Putin, his first visit to the United States, he was nobody. He was like some basically colonel level guy at the FSB, I think. He was a very unimportant human being. And he told the diplomats that he was with that the Soviets won the Cold War, and he meant it. And this conversation was so jarring that many of them wrote about it at the time, even though this guy was super unimportant. And all of those people then compared their notes a decade later when he's now president of the country and said, wow, how did that happen? So they have a system of creating these assets. Asset is anyone who can be used, can be manipulated, will spread falsehoods, but also anyone who will divide. I mean, is Donald Trump supporting Ukraine or supporting Russia? That's actually really hard to say. You know, when I met with high-level Ukrainian leaders in 2017. And so Trump had been president for about 8 months at this point. And it was at an annual conference. The previous 2 years, we talked about what a danger Donald Trump would be to Ukraine. And here we were, almost a year into his presidency, talking about the fact that he greenlit sending lethal aid to Ukraine. The Ukrainians were like, he's kind of better than Obama, but we still don't trust him. What's going on? If you're Putin, that matters less. What matters more is the amount of division, the lack of credibility, the fact that he's undermining NATO. You know, undermining NATO could be literally a fatal mistake. You know, many folks here grew up during the 2 minutes to midnight, hide under your desk nuclear drills. NATO is the only reason that didn't actually become a reality. And so Donald Trump, in a way, just by getting up in the morning, is a big win for the Russians. So is he an actual agent? I don't think in the way we think of that word. But I think in the way the Russians think, absolutely. Anybody else have any questions?
I know you did say, well, the whole thing about the GOP, whatever, how did they get sort of stolen away? And one of the most scariest things to me, as a person who grew up in a very probably lefty kind of family or something, because of course they were all educators, and you know what happens with those. But that said, can you just, I know it's a whole nother talk, but was there a time that in your current understanding, was there a time in your understanding that an event or series of events that just stole away a group of people that had certainly very, very more conservative views than myself? I'm sorry, I'm a social worker.
Yeah.
But that said, there were very reasonable people with different targets. That's all.
Yeah.
What happened to them?
Well, I've got a few theories on this. But let me take it back a little bit. We all remember a time when we didn't have Google Maps in our pockets, okay? And we might be walking or driving. Let's say we're walking down a path, and it splits left from right. And the right path tends to go towards the water, and the left path goes deeper into the woods. And we don't know which way to go, and we're a little bit lost. And one of your friends says, you know, in my experience, when you go towards the water, you wind up getting trapped by the river, and that's usually not the right way to go if that's where you're trying to go. And the other friend says, I don't know, the woods are dark, and at least if I stick by the river, I'll always have a landmark. What I've just described is ideology. This is how ideology works. You know, if you go back to the foundation of the United States of America, Thomas Jefferson is the best example of someone who is conservative. His primary fear is that we have another king. We have an American seize power and become a king. And John Adams, his famous frenemy, to use today's terminology, his primary concern is, but we're going to be reconquered by European power. So John Adams is always going to pick stronger government, and Thomas Jefferson is always going to pick weaker government, and neither one of these guys actually has any clue at all which of those threats is the most real. And that is simply not true today. If you're buying a washing machine, I can tell you the best washing machine on the market, period. What are your needs? List your needs. I will tell you the best washing machine in the market. You want to know what stock to buy? You can read 10 articles, you get the data. You want to know what's global temperature. Global warming is a ridiculous debate. We've got thermometers. You can find out, you can pull out your pocket and find out what the temperature in Timbuktu is. What do you mean people deny that temperatures are going up? You can look up the temperatures. You can see the temperatures going up. Is it really that extreme an idea that we can put all that stuff in a spreadsheet and do some math and figure out the average? Ideology is largely completely obsolete because you have so much data in real time analyzed by experts and supercomputers, and you don't need ideology. George Bush runs in 2000 at the crossroads for this because in a lot of ways Reagan data and we've got all the Clinton data, and data's getting pretty good, and we should really be moving beyond ideological decisions on things like the economy. And yet, George Bush is just not that bright. And he doesn't care about he's super ideological. He doesn't care about any of that stuff. And what do we get? We get 8 years of George Bush, a textbook example of how none of George Bush's policies work. And he leaves office with an approval rating, well, at the election time anyway, in 2008, when Barack Obama wins, he's got the lowest approval numbers of any president in American history at 28, with a margin of error +3, and some people telling you, I'm pretty sure it's 3 points lower than that. Okay? The American people reject George Bush because his ideologies all failed. Why was there even a Republican running in that election?
Propaganda?
Because there has to be. We created a political system where someone then has to run supporting the ideologies of George Bush. Because the Republicans are at a crossroad at this point. They either have to admit that everything they believed is bullshit, and they have to change, or they double down and reject reality as it is. I believe we have been in the mixing of those two waters ever since, where the Republicans can't figure out what their core ideology is or what their purpose of the party is. And in that process, we have a greater and greater rejection of the truth. And if you look at the 2015 and 2016 primaries, there were some very conservative, smart people who ran in those primaries. And I can't name a single one of them. But there were. I know because I decided to vote in the Republican primary that year so that I would not have Donald Trump as the Republican nominee. And man, that's really going to bother me that I can't think of who I voted for. But it didn't win, so it doesn't matter. But that was the second turning point. Because Donald Trump runs on, if this propaganda funnel is some people's seasoning, This was Donald Trump's main meal, okay? He's eating that paprika instead of putting it on the chicken. And so Donald Trump runs on this system of disinformation. It's what brought him into the Obama birtherism is what brought him back into the public spotlight on a political level. And then he develops an ideology, a political platform that's anti-immigrant, listen, whether you want immigrants in this country or not, immigration is nowhere close to the top 10 most urgent things facing us. Period. You can find you I'm preaching to the choir here. You can find you dozens and dozens of economists that say we don't have enough immigrants. And yet, major flaws with our border, major flaws with the systems that are in place. Immigration ain't a crisis. I mean, it is to some communities that are localized. And it's, again, broken system we need to fix. Not a crisis. He creates the crisis. This is actually one of the greatest things that the Russians always do. In Syria, I was covering Syria 8 my whole life. It was 16 hours a day, Syria. I named my firstborn child after a Syrian activist. And my hair stood on the back of my neck when Russian media and Vladimir Putin started talking about how they had intelligence that the Syrian rebels were going to use chemical weapons. Because I knew exactly what was going to happen next, which is Syria's ally was going to use chemical weapons. That's exactly what happened. You always accuse the other person of being what you want to be. If you're the Republicans, you accuse the Democrats of grooming pedophiles when you're flying on private airplanes with Jeffrey Epstein.
I just want to try to answer your question as well. I think never agreed with the Republicans, but a lot of them were smart. They were talented people. I believe a lot of them had the best interests of America. There was a big change when Donald Trump became president. And suddenly he pushed out all of those normal Republicans. You know, this is, right. Right. Well, as I said before, there's been an ongoing initiative to change our government for 50 years. The Heritage Foundation is funded by rich conservative Republicans, and so does the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society gives names of Supreme Court justices and other judges to the Republican president. They groom people knowing that they'll decide their way. And so it's been a long, long process, but I think it came to a head when Trump came in. He pushed out anyone that was left that was kind of a middle-of-the-road, reasonable Republican. So now we're left with MAGA people who are so extreme. They don't pass anything. They're just constantly creating conspiracy theories, lying, and I think that's where we're at.
But see, this is a great point, Kate, because you talk about the Heritage Foundation, okay? The Heritage Foundation and the Project for a New American Century, these are the think tanks that got George Bush elected, okay? And they introduce an extremely aggressive foreign policy that is absolutely imperial, and it's designed to control all of the countries in the world by influence or direct or indirect control, satellite control. And a lot of that is geared towards controlling oil. In fact, the New American Century, if you went to their website in, I want to say about maybe spring of 99, this would be about a year and a half before the election, and you went to their website, it's this beautiful website where it showed the United States right in the center, and then it zoomed out and all the other countries of the world appeared with an American flag. They had to get rid of that website once George Bush became popular because it was way too on the nose. But I'll never forget it. But if you interviewed George Bush, again, this came out in all of the stuff that has come out about the Iraq War, George Bush was not an American imperialist. George Bush didn't invade Iraq. The people who advised George Bush were the American imperialists. The people who advised George Bush wanted to control the oil. So these forces have been doing Kremlin-like disinformation campaigns against us for a long time.
Okay, are there any more questions or comments before we close? Oh, go ahead.
One more question then. So I'm so with you. So where's the hope of the future if Democrats or reasonable people
Yeah.
use truth and specifics in Google Maps to tell the truth, or real information that they've, researched and whatever? What if we don't believe in propaganda as a way to serve society beyond a certain very small subset? But we're controlled by it now.
Yeah.
We have been for 50 years, but really controlled now. I think you're right on. How are we supposed to fight that?
Here's a note of optimism, folks. You ever get optimism in your day?
I want to.
In January of this year, I formed a secretive nationwide online group of about 35 very smart people who I knew personally and trusted a lot. And our mission was to use a funnel, not to spread disinformation, but to spread information, and to fight the messaging war that has gone unwaged by the American left for generations. And I now no longer know what to do with that group, because the messaging that is coming out of the American left is so strong right now. It is so on point. You can see so many awesome, informative memes, really manipulative, really effective messaging. But one of the reasons, and this is what keeps me up, because we are so far away from the election, that messaging isn't coming from a Democratic politician. It's coming from people like us. And my worry is that when we get closer to the election, the messaging that's going to come out of Donald Trump's political opponents is simply not going to be anywhere near as effective as what we've got. So we need to really fight for the ideological high ground, to really make our own funnel here, folks. What are the core things that you want to see in our society, and begin to shape your own messaging, amplify your own messaging? You don't have to shape it all. In fact, you don't have to shape most of it. It's already out there. Amplify that messaging yourself. Weaponize information, weaponize empathy the way they are weaponizing disinformation and apathy and
cruelty. Okay, well, thank you so much for attending.
We did have one more question, Kay, and I know we're out of time, but I did want to get to it. It's been so patient.
I appreciate you bringing up the election, because I have that same thought as, like, we have great messaging now, but we're a ways away. And something that you talked about in the presentation that I thought was wonderful was how in those years after the Soviet Union fell, they were still left with all these people from that government who didn't leave, and it seems like they are the ones who got Putin in there to become the autocrat that he is.
Yep.
Was it something that they didn't do in that country that we should make sure that we're keeping center to make sure that all of these fascists are gone when we win one day?
That's a really big question. Here's what I will say. I couldn't even begin to answer it, I don't think. But what I will say is, power vacuums don't work. I have been, my conservative friends think I'm a crazy socialist wacko. But a lot of my liberal friends think I'm like a right of center. They're all wrong. But on foreign policy in particular, the Democrats have for a very long time been entirely too weak. We believe that if we pull back our power, that the people in independent countries will rise. And that is so demonstrably false. As we pull back our power, Russia and China and Iran and the Saudis and the Qataris, very malicious people, the people who created this funnel, they're the ones who fill that vacuum. And so, you know, I was very much against George Bush's foreign policy, but you begin to get, as a reaction to that, a groupthink that does the same thing. It rejects facts. I'll never forget in 2007, MoveOn.org ran a nationwide banner and overpass and what do you call it, billboard ads about General Petraeus, who was the George Bush's newest commander of the Iraq War, and a great patriot and a great person, an incredibly smart man. And they ran, he was pushing for more troops in Iraq. And MoveOn.org ran the banner, General Petraeus. And I was all about that ad. I was like, you're right. You know, we shouldn't have gone to war. This general wants to throw another couple of 100,000 soldiers at it. It's irresponsible, and we shouldn't do it. Turns out, I wasn't, at the ripe age of 26, I wasn't in any cabinet meetings. And if I had been, I would have known that General Petraeus had a very good idea of what he was going to do with those soldiers and a very good understanding of what was going on in Iraq. And he effectively won that war. He effectively ended the most violent stages of that war with that troop surge. And it was so effective that when Barack Obama came to power, despite criticizing George Bush for the surge, Barack Obama then gave in to Petraeus and gave him whatever he wanted. So our groupthink at that time led us to that kind of rejection of facts. And there's a danger there. So I would, you know, I think we're beginning to see it on the left with Ukraine, where, hey, we had this frozen conflict that we kind of ignored for years, and then bam, frozen conflicts don't stay frozen, and Putin did what he did and invaded full scale, and it's ugly, and then Donald Trump basically came in and said, we like the bad guys and not the good guys. And that has awakened many Americans, especially on the left, to the need for a more robust foreign policy. And the reason why I bring this up is, you know, you cannot let, what's the phrase? You can't let sleeping dragons lie. You know, yeah, sleeping dragons. We're going to get to a point where this whole Trump thing is going to fall apart. But all of the damage that has been done is going to be very hard to undo. And all the people who did it, they're still going to be there.
Okay. So we're losing our space right now because we only had it till 5. So hopefully we'll see some of you June 2nd at the Northborough Historical Society, 5:30 for our fun-filled potluck. And then our next meeting after that is 6/7, is a Saturday at Shrewsbury Library. And please, please, please come to our big rally, 6/14, Worcester Common, right behind Worcester City Hall. Thanks again for coming. We really enjoyed it.
Jim
I hope
Miller.
you enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Make sure you get a business card. My business card. And then we have gain cards somewhere as well, so you're all informed.